Hi, everybody. This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog and our YouTube channel and our great sponsors, Italy Rooting, Abitiva Casa, and Phil Italy. And my guest today is Stephen Pishner from West Virginia. So welcome, Stephen. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So Pishner's not an Italian last name. So what are your Italian roots?
That's what we got stuck with. Our real name is Pishoneri, Piscioneri. And there are several different kinds of stories about why it was changed. Some people say, well, maybe it was for work, and others were like, well, maybe Ellis Island couldn't spell Pishoneri, or the third one is, we have enough of those, you're now Pishner. So it's one of the three, or a combination of all of them. I'm not sure. But all the early records and all the documents I have say Pishoneri. On my mother's side, my mother's last name was Alessio. It should be Alessio. And we were given an extra L somehow, so it became Allessio. So when I'm looking for Alessios in the United States, if they have two L's, I know they're closer to being related than not. So Pishoneri and Alessio, they're from two different parts of Italy in Calabria. So the Pishoneri come from Cavolonia, which is from the provincia di Reggio di Calabria, and the Alessios come from San Giovanni in Fiore, provincia di Cosenza. And in this area where I live here in West Virginia, there are a lot of people who have origins in San Giovanni in Fiore.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, and that's something I want to talk to you about because, I learned, I guess there's a few years now about the migration to West Virginia, which I had no idea about. So when did the family arrive there? Do you know why they came?
Well, they arrived in the 90s. Italy evidently received word that America was looking for workers, and specifically in the coal mines. So, they left and came here. And once one or two started coming here and the word got back, well, it might be better to come here than they came in droves. And so all of my grandparents came through Ellis Island, and they all came to West Virginia because once one got here, the word was out. And it was interesting because, Calabria almost like transplanted itself here in West Virginia. And when you go to Calabria, you look at Calabria and you think, well, you can see why there's some similarities, you could draw some connections there. But, they stayed here, and that none of them ever went back. They all stayed. They all married here. They all had families here. And, both sides of my family are Italian, but they're different kinds of Italian. Even within a 3-hour drive from San Giovanni to Cavolonia, there's some specific differences. But I've enjoyed, being raised in the atmosphere of immigrant grandparents. If you haven't done that, you missed out. And all you can do is listen to the stories, appreciate them, and go from there. But yeah, West Virginia has a lot of Italian people, and where I live here, it was probably 30 or 40% Italian within the county of Harrison County. But, and people are still in touch with their roots. There's a lot of travel back and forth from West Virginia families to Italy. There's a lot of Italian customs still in place. There's a lot of work within the Italian Heritage Festival that happened. I just finished Italian Heritage Festival on Labor Day weekend. Thousands of people here in West Virginia, and people come here and they go, I didn't associate Italian with West Virginia, and I said, well, surprise. Years ago there was a song, "Come Home to West Virginia, America's Best Kept Secret." We're one of the secrets in West Virginia. That's for sure.
No, there's no question about that. Us Italians from New York, we just think the Italian immigration stopped here.
Yeah, no. It has a great, New York has a big to do with my family because every one of my relatives, all of my grandparents, all came through Ellis Island, every one of them. And one came, I think it was my grandmother or my dad's side. One of them came and they couldn't get out because you had to have somebody receive you, and somebody wasn't there. And I think it was my great grandfather, and they had to wait. They had to stay there the whole weekend and wait because they were closing. So they had to stay there on Ellis Island for the whole weekend. And then finally someone came on Monday to receive them into the country. But, great stories. I mean, you can't recreate this scene, but boy, you can talk about it. And the more you talk about it, it's like a prism. You see a different glimmer about the story, whether it's good or bad, whether it's suffering or joy. I mean, it's just a story that's unheard of. Who leaves something and bets or takes a risk that it's going to be okay? I mean, I don't know anybody. Well, I mean, we see immigration today, but I don't know a lot of young people that, I don't know. It just seems like that time was more risky. You leave what you know and your family, and you don't know if you're coming back, and you're going on a boat. You've never traveled even out of your own region. And you get on a boat and you come thousands of miles away to a place that doesn't speak your language and think you're going to make it. I mean, that's a major risk. That's a major bet. But they did it. And that's why we're here. That's why you and I are talking to each other.
Yeah, exactly. And, to your point, there was not that there was no contact with people in the homeland, but, it was a 3-week, send a piece of mail. It was a 3-week boat ride back and forth, it wasn't like today. If you come here today and you just pick up the phone and you're instantly doing a video call, it's a little bit different.
No, even the mail was spotty, because at one point they told me that there was a mail strike. So some people they said, my relatives used to say they took the mail and they threw it in the Mediterranean, and who knows if the mail got there or anything that was in it. I mean, I have some of the letters from the old days, even when I was writing in 1984, when I first found my relatives, again, reconnected after 60 years of, silence and not understanding who was where and that kind of stuff. I found that it just took time.
Yeah. Now you've been back. You've been to the
7
hometowns?
times. I've been to seven times.
Yeah.
Now, what was interesting is that, my grandparents, like they said, they never went back, and they never ever said, I want you to go one day. I want you to see the place. I want you to go see who's left. They never said that. Never said that. They were content being here. There was more hesitation on my mother's side of the family, and it often bothered me. I mean, why didn't anybody call, or why didn't anybody come from there? Or I just wanted to see my grandparents in action with other Italians that were relatives, but it was just odd, So I only had one grandparent left in 1984. And my grandparents died in 1980, 1982 with on my mother's side. And on my father's side, I had one grandmother left from Catalonia, but her husband, Domenico, died in 1965. Interestingly enough, though, he went to visit my mother in January of 1965, and he told my mother she was pregnant. She says, "You're going to have a boy, and he's going to have blue eyes." And then he died shortly after that. And then I was born in April, and I was the boy with the blue eyes. He knew that. But it was interesting. So they didn't really say, well, you got to go back. So in 84, or really summer of 83, I was talking with my aunts. They were living in the home place of my mother's parents. And I said, well, who's left in Italy? Do we have relatives? And they told me the names. And I thought, okay, now here I am, 18 years old. I think, the world's at my fingertips and I'm not afraid of anything, I guess, And I thought, well, I'm going to find out. I said, well, okay, I'm going to find out. I said, I don't think they're going to be able to. I don't think they have telephones, or, they're poor. It's a poor part of Italy. I said, okay. So what's an 18-year-old do? It picks up the phone and pushes 0. Here comes the operator. And I said, I need information in San Giovanni in Fiore in Cosenza in Calabria, Italy. Okay, please hold. So they get me an Italian operator. So this operator here in West Virginia, with a little bit of with a West Virginia accent, is speaking to an Italian accented English-speaking person. And I just interrupt, and I said, operator, if I could interrupt you, please. I said, I know enough Italian to tell her what I want, so we can make this work go a little faster. She said, well, okay. So I talked to the operator directly, and I asked her, I said, can you find me in San Giovanni in Fiore someone whose name is Maria Alessio, or Maria Teresa Alessio? She starts laughing at me. And I said, why are you laughing? She goes, oh, ci sono tanti. There's so many. So I said, okay. I said, give me 3. So she gives me 3. And I said, well, thank you very much. And I closed the conversation and hung up. And I ran over to my aunt's house, because one of my aunts still spoke the dialect of San Giovanni in Fiore. So they call it San Giovanese. And I said, we got to call one of these people. I said, I think I found relatives. they're like, well, I don't know about this. Is get scary now, So I said, let's call. So then she said, well, come on Sunday and you call. So I came over on Sunday after Mass. We had dinner. And, they had these huge telephone numbers, 011390984. And so I said, let's call. So you call, and that was the days of transatlantic cable, where you had to hear that, doo, you had to hear all that before they answer. And this woman answers, and she goes, pronto. And my aunt tells her who she is, and this woman says who she is. And we have this wonderful conversation, and I'm all psyched, because we got this relative, and I'm just loving it, and I'm listening on the other phone. And then she says in Italian that she was not your relative. She said, I'm sorry, this is a wonderful conversation, but I'm not your relative. But I know where they live, and I know who they are. I'll go get the phone number and you call me next week and I'll give you the telephone number. Well, next week couldn't have come any faster for me. So we went back over on next Sunday and I said, we got to call this woman. My aunts are a little bit hesitant still at this point because, Stephen's pushing them into uncharted territory here. So we call and this woman says, oh yeah, I spoke with him. She says, here's the telephone number. You call this number. They're waiting for your call. So we got the telephone number and we hung up with the first non-relative who was Italian. And I said, then we're going to call a real relative. And we did. And after 60 years of non-communication, other than a few letters that got lost, we now, for the first time, had heard a voice of a blood relative in San Giovanni. And what's interesting is where we were calling from, the telephone sat on one of those long buffet kind of credenzas, you know what I mean? And for years and years and years, I'd walk in and on the left-hand side of the room where this credenza was, there were all these pictures of all these Italian kids, really young, but they're all dressed in black and white. It's one of those black and white pictures. And everybody's got, like this, faccia lunga, for stern look, And now we're talking to one of the kids who's now 80-some years old.
Wow.
Now, one of the things about San Giovanni in Fiore, first of all, just to clarify that San Giovanni is the patron of the city, St. John the Baptist. In Fiore comes from the name Gioacchino da Fiore, who was, a clergyman, a priest, a theologian of his day. He was ahead of his time. And he's buried there in a catacomb in the Abbazia there, Abbazia Florense, they call it. But not to digress. So these pictures were there, but to distinguish which Alessio family, like the woman who laughed at me on the telephone, you have to have a nickname. The nickname tells you which Alessio you're dealing with here. So my family's nickname in dialect was pronounced Maestro Carmine, which means Maestro Carmine, which means the master Carmen, who was master of gun making and clock making. The family that was their trade. So they call him the master. So Maestro Carmine. So my aunt says in dialect that she is the daughter of Giovanni, which was my grandfather, Maestro Carmine. And she said, my great aunt said, she was the daughter of Francesco Maestro Carmine, which was my grandfather's dad. And bingo, we had the connection for the first time. And from that conversation, life really changed for me because I found out a bigger picture of who I was and who I was related to, and a ton of other remarkable things. For example,
so I have to ask you. So you're 18 years old. Why do you? Because I believe in this calling and all that crap, right?
Yeah.
Why? I mean, why? Why do you think you had to do this?
The old Italians used to say, you get a spina, you get like a little thorn, something that just pushes you. And there was always this thing. I always found it fascinating that I walked into a relative's house who didn't come here, who didn't speak the language, who lived a different life in another part of the world. I was into geography, and it's so far away. And I hadn't traveled very much out of West Virginia, other than maybe one time to Washington, D.C. or Pittsburgh or whatever. That's 2 hours to Pittsburgh, 4 hours to D.C. That's not a big deal in a car. But it just fascinated. I just thought this. To me, it was like a renowned hero story. Somebody had landed on the moon. Somebody had landed in America. And I just thought, what? This is a big deal. And nobody's saying anything about it. But, maybe that's the performer in me because I'm a musician, because, everything I hear and see is a performance or an act one of something, and I just did it. And I just thought, well, I just saw we had the opportunity to do it. I mean, we had limited means. There was no internet and things. I had a telephone with an operator, and I had a pen and a piece of paper. That's all I had on this. My parents were always like, this was just normal. They didn't even think about it like that, nor did they push for it.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I always wish I had asked my grandmother more questions. I used to sit there and play cards with her. I never asked her about Italy or anything like that. It was only later, that I started looking into it. And to your point, to me, it helps you know who you are and where you came from. At least for me, anyway.
Well, actually, during the pandemic, when we couldn't go anywhere, I was bored to death. I was talking with someone and I said, maybe I should write a book about this stuff. And the person said, do it. So I locked myself in the room and I wrote I think it's like 22 or so chapter book. And it's still in my computer. I have to proofread it. But my title is It Started with the Phone Call.
Yeah, great title, yeah.
I mean, I can remember this. I can remember everything about the first time I went like it was yesterday. I can tell you where we were. I can tell you what I wore. I can tell you who I talked to. I can tell you what car we were in. So I wrote a memoirs about this whole finding of the relatives and the first trip there. But within the conversation, that initial conversation here in West Virginia with my great aunt in San Giovanni, she revealed that we had relatives that lived in America that were her kids. And I'm going like, okay, no one knew this. And we were so close. There was one that lived in Detroit, and I have relatives who live in Detroit. My mother's siblings two brothers lived in them, one stayed, and he had a big family up there. My grandmother's sister raised her family, it was very gracious family, in Detroit. Nobody knew these people were there. And then there was one in Toronto. But back up to the 1970s, someone came to West Virginia and he was looking for his zio Giovanni, which was my grandfather. And they came to an area called Bridgeport, which is about 5-7 minutes from Clarksburg, where I am. And he said, I'm trying to find my uncle. And they didn't know him by Giovanni Alessio because my grandfather then was known more by John Alessio. And he said, well, if you see him or if you can get this to him, here's my information, telephone number and a name. Okay. So someone apparently came and gave this to my grandfather, and my grandfather put it in a strong box. In dialect, they called the strong box a gasciuvorto. So the gasciuvorto was in the dresser, chest of drawers. So when my grandfather died, my aunts found this gasciuvorto, with this number in it, and they just kept it. They just put it back, just leave it alone. They didn't want to throw stuff away. And then when my grandmother died, they found it again. When we talked to the aunt in the initial conversation, the great aunt from Italy, she says, I have a son, and she gives his name, who lives in Toronto. That was the name on the card in the gasciuvorto, in the strongbox. The guy was in Clarksburg, Bridgeport area, looking for my grandfather to connect, and they never made a connection. He was actually here when my grandparents were alive. Can you imagine what that would have been like?
Yeah, wow.
My grandfather would have gotten to see a nephew, a son of his sister, Maria Teresa. So I said, give me that number. And you knew what I was going to do next. We're going to call this guy. And we called him. And he said, yeah, I heard that you might call. And he said, and then he says, my mother, which is the aunt that we talked to initially, he says, my mother, came to Canada once, and she came to Detroit as well. I'm thinking, my grandfather could have connected with his sister that he hadn't seen since he left as a young boy, like at 15 years old. I mean, it's like one of those movies when someone's looking for somebody and they're right smack dab next to each other in New York City, and one goes out the swinging door and the other one goes in the swinging door. It's like that, one of those kind of events in my mind. And it was just driving me. I'm going like, it's like not another close call where we could have reconnected. And so I had that spina just driving me crazy. Okay, this is it. We have to go to Italy. I'm going. And I was going to go by myself. And my aunts and my uncle decided they wanted to jump on board, and they went too.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah, that's great. I had a similar thing because my father once told us he had family in Torre del Greco and near Naples, but he never said who. And then we wound up going there and meeting his first cousins and all of that. But they had been in connection with my grandmother until she passed away in like 1963 or something like that, 61 or whatever it was. And then my father's oldest sister for years after that through the 1960s. And they said the same thing. They said they went to Whitestone, Queens, where we lived. They went to the house where my grandmother lived and my aunt lived, and they weren't there anymore. They had moved. My grandmother had died. My aunt had moved. And they said, well, we went to the house, but nobody was there. I was like, I lived a mile from there. To your point, makes me nuts. And the other thing was I had a cousin, fourth cousin, who she contacted me one day and she says, I think we're researching the same person. We may be relatives. I said, who's the person? She says, Maria Piramalo. I said, yes, it's my grandfather's sister, my great grandfather's sister. No, I don't think so. I said, I'm positive. There's no question that that's who they are. I said, well, do the DNA test, do a DNA test, do Ancestry. She did it and we didn't come up as a match. And she said, we're not a match. I said, they're wrong. There's a mistake somewhere. I said, let me look. I said, well, you come up as a match to me. I don't know how it doesn't match. Anyway, what we found out was that our families were so closely tied for years, and we never knew each other. She said, well, my grandmother is Beatrice. I said, well, that's my father used to call her Aunt Beatrice. I said, in fact, when I was looking for my first apartment, when I got married the first time, I said, we drove past your grandmother's house, and my father said, Aunt Beatrice lives there. But I was 20 years old. It went right over my head. But, it's not an act. I mean, we connected after all of these years and found out that there was like a 30-year gap with these families that live so close to each other, that were so intertwined for many, many years. And I eventually moved into a apartment just a few blocks from where her grandmother lived. And I said, we probably passed each other on the street in Flushing and didn't know we were related,
See, those are remarkable stories. I don't know if I guess other cultures have the same kind of thing. It just seems much more, I don't know. It just seems highly passionate and highly, I don't know, that deep. And it's just so, for example, so when I made the trip to San Giovanni in Fiore for the first time, I went to see all those kids who are now 80 some years old. And my grandfather's brother, Rosario, he said, I cried and cried and cried when my babysitter left. And I said, well, okay. And I'm thinking, like, why are they telling me this? The babysitter was his future sister-in-law, my grandmother.
Wow.
But the big thing was, as soon as I got in the car with my cousin Paolo, he says, tell me the words. Do you know the words, the secret words? I said, what are you talking about? He said, the secret words. I said, Paolo, what are we talking about? He said, your grandfather, my uncle, they used to tell a story about, he used to go get buckets of water and bring them back to the house or to the farm or whatever. But where he had to go was through this kind of woodsy area, foresty area. And they always sent him because they knew he was afraid of the wolves. And he would go and get the buckets of water. And they think he would come running out of there scared to death. And he would say some words and the wolves would lie down and be docile. And he'd walk past them. And they could never figure out how he got them to do that. Now, my grandfather never told this story ever. Ever. And my cousin Paolo, he knew this story.
That's crazy.
But the story has a twist. You got to have, on the Cabolognese side, on my father's side, very normal. Got here, left A, got to B, lived in C. Boom, boom, boom. Everybody had a nice life. No questions, no drama, no mystery, nothing. On my mother's side, I started to smell what was the hesitancy. So we go to the courthouse, and I want to get my grandfather's birth record. So I go and look up his parents. He's not there. His siblings are. He's not there. Okay, now the mystery begins, because there was a little bit of that early on that said that when someone said, well, he was raised by one, but his real mother was another. Okay. Why? Well, because she was sick and she had to go somewhere. And so the other one raised them, stepmother raised him, and he had to choose between the two. And so he chose the stepmother because that's the one he knew, and the mother couldn't take it. And there was like drama there. So I'm looking and looking and looking and looking and looking and looking. Couldn't find it. Couldn't find it. Couldn't find it. So I eventually found out the answer, that I wasn't supposed to know who the real mother was. And I found her. And when I put her into ancestry.com, boom, the whole thing lit up. I had the right name. But, it was a big, long story that, I don't know, it took like 40 years for me to find the answer, but I found it. And I found the real answer. But now my question is, the new mother, or the mother that has surfaced, that she's long gone, where did she go? Who was she? What was she like? And I think I found some more traces of who she was. I think she ended up in Argentina, perhaps. I'm not totally sure. But, it was just wild. But in the midst of all this, even backing up about part way in all these trips, I had made 7 trips to Italy. About halfway through, one of the relatives decides to tell me a detail that nobody ever bothered to talk about. And they said, well, you ought to call your cousin Carmine, who lives in Naples. I said, why should I call my cousin Carmine, who lives in Naples, that I have never met, who's like 80-some years old at this point? They said, oh, because he's been studying this for like 40 or 50 years. He can give you all these answers. And I'm saying, you couldn't have told me this about several thousands of dollars ago. So guess what? I headed to Naples 1 year. And there he was waiting for me there at the train station, and went to the house, and we had a marvelous conversation. And he had done major, major work, even finding the family crest that was still ingrained in a building, and all of this wonderful, wonderful stuff. But I said, Carmen, are you going to write this stuff down? And he said, yeah, I am. So his daughter also teaches English, Gabriela. And so he wrote this huge book about this thick. And it's basically a collection of information, stories, and bios and pictures that he's put together over the years. He passed away a few years ago, but he gave me the book and the updates. And I made it as gifts for a lot of the relatives here. I just went to the printing shop and said, reprint this and I'll give it to everybody as a gift. Some didn't read it. Now some are looking at it and going like, oh, it's this and this. And so we went back and we're cross-referencing things. And I found all kinds of great information. But to have a great opportunity like this, to even be able to delve into the history of the family deeply, at least on my mother's side. On my father's side, I knew somewhat because I had great-grandparents and grandparents that were already here. But, where there's that mystery, I just draw into it like, what's the answer? What's the hesitancy? Why can't we talk about this? What's going on? Because today people don't care who was raised by whom or who had what baby. But to them it was una vergogna, a big shame or something, like a sin or whatever. And I even went to churches. I had priests and nuns looking up things for me in Latin. They couldn't find it. And so to this day, I can't find his documentation, but I can find information because what was interesting, I work with the Catholic Church in West Virginia. And I thought, what? They were both married here in West Virginia in the Italian church in our city. So I called archives and I said, can you find me this marriage certificate? And that's where I got my confirmation, because I'd gone to the courthouse here to look at the wedding marriage certificate, and it had the adopted, or the, when he was adopted or raised by the whatever you call it, the mother that raised him. But when I went to the church record, it was not her. And I found out the real name. And the hesitancy was that she was a distant relative and that he was born out of a relationship, not a marriage.
Right. Yeah.
Which today we say big deal. Then it was like, again, but I thought, so my grandfather put the official legal name at the courthouse, but the birth mother name he put on the document that went to the church. And I even have the signature of the priest who did that. And I thought, okay, I found this out. I found it out by mistake, kind of. But nobody ever wanted to tell us that story. And I think that's probably why they said don't go back. There was another relative that came from Canada, from Calgary. She came to visit one time. And she alluded to all of this, and this was wild, And my grandmother really wasn't crazy on her hanging around because she thought maybe she would, spill the beans. But again, more drama, Bob, So this woman comes from Canada back in the 80s, and she says she wanted to come and visit. So she came to visit. And my grandmother was hospitable to her, but she really wasn't like, and she was on pins and needles while she was here. And when the woman went back to Canada, this relative, she really took a liking to my uncle that was living here, that lived here, and he passed on now, but he was living here, and she thought that he reminded her so much of my grandfather that she was looking for her cousin. So my grandmother said, I don't want you to go see her. He said, I'm going to go. I'm going to go. They're inviting me up there. I'm going to go. She goes, don't go. I don't want you to go. And he says, no. I said, Ma, I'm going to go. And she looked at me. She pointed to him. She said, if you go, when you come back, I won't be here. And he goes. And my grandmother dies while he's in Canada.
Wow, that's crazy. That's crazy.
Again, drama. We can't go from A to B like everybody else in normal families. We got to have, drama.
Well, I'll tell you something that I've just heard this story 2 weeks ago. I interviewed somebody from Corona, Queens, and she knew my cousin. My cousin's like 92 or something like that. And we're having this conversation, and he goes, do you know the story about our great grandmother? I said, no, what story? He said, when I was about 15 or 16, I walk in the room, and if my mother and grandma were talking in Italian about something, as soon as I walked in the room, they would stop. And he says, I went to the Korean War. I came back, and I was playing cards with grandma. And I asked her, Grandma, why do you always stop talking? She went, no, I can't talk. He said, come on, Grandma, tell me what. No. Finally, he said, I gotta say, he said, I don't think it was my grandmother's sister. I think it was my great grandmother's sister got pregnant in Italy by some guy. And she said, well, you know what you have to do. And she said, he won't marry me. He said, he won't marry me. She said, well, then you have to do the other thing. She said, what other thing? You have to get rid of him. She said, well, I can't do that. So according to my grandmother, my great grandmother took care of the problem, did away with him.
My God. Well, again, you can't make this stuff up.
No.
So let me give you this little piece of history here that, again, when the answer's staring you in the face, it's staring you in the face and you don't. So in my grandparents' bedroom on the wall, there was this little circular sphere kind of plate that they had hanging there. There were 3 pictures on it. It had a woman in an oval at the top, and she had on what we call the pacchiana, which is an Italian costume-ish thing that they wore as an everyday thing in San Giovanni. And it had my grandfather and his brother who was killed during a war. And for years and years and years and years, I said, who's that woman? Nobody knew. Nobody knew. So my aunt took it off of the shelf, off of the wall there. And she looked at it. She goes, oh, it says Virginia on the back there. And she put it back. She goes, I don't know. I don't know who that is. The woman's name, the real birth mother, her name was Virginia. Now, to make things even more mysterious, my aunt, who was with me that day, looking and said, well, who's this? Didn't know. Her middle name is Virginia, and she never knew why. It was Clara Virginia. Didn't know why. So then fast forward to Ancestry.com days. So when I found all this out, at some point, another bunch of people here in Clarksburg stopped me and said, we want to talk to you. I said, what's this about? So is it about music, about being Italian, or about church stuff? And I said, well, it's about being Italian. I said, okay. So I went to their house, and he says, we think we're related. I said, okay. So one of the members of the family was really into this, young person. And she says, she's really into, she says, I think we're related to you about 10 times, 10 different ways. And I said, okay. When I saw her, she looks like the woman in the picture. That's the Virginia. So it's just like, what on earth happened to make all this happen? It's remarkable. I'm into this history stuff. I'm into this, this genealogy stuff. I'm fascinated with this PBS show that, has all this stuff. Actually, the guy who does that show is from West Virginia. But anyway, I just think it's remarkable. I think we're remarkable people. I think everybody's a remarkable person. I think we're all miracles. All of us in some way or another are miracles, because this stuff doesn't happen to get us to where we are, to who we are. You can't design it. It's just a miracle to think about that. And years ago, And this is where the Italian thing comes in for me. I always go back to this phrase. Years ago, there was a group in Pittsburgh. They were called I Campagnoli. They were a gruppo folkloristico, a folkloristic dance group. And they sang and danced, and they were fabulous group performers. And in fact, when Epcot opened in Disney, they were called to go to Epcot and perform. They opened Epcot with their performance. It's called I Campagnoli. And there was a woman who ran this group. Her name was Jane Farrow. When they would come to Clarksburg, they came to Clarksburg for over 25 years in a row. Full costume. They knew all the songs and all the dialects. They had real instruments playing everything, mandolins, guitars, accordion, stand-up bass, the whole bit. And she was interviewed, and they said, Jane, what would life be like, or what would the world be like without Italians? And she said, bland. And I thought, she nailed it. She just nailed it. I mean, everybody brings something to the table. And then I said, there's something about Italian culture that is just uniquely different. But I tell people, I say, I deal with a lot of Italian people. I'm in a lot of Italian events and performances because I'm a musician as well. And I said, you don't have to be Italian, because I said, you know what? Italians can come and enjoy something at an Italian festival. I said, but you don't have to be Italian. I said, but I bet you, even if you're not Italian, I bet you your stomach is, because, the food thing has just connected people for centuries, it seems like, Italian food. And speaking of that, I was in New York last year when my band played for Columbus Day there on the red carpet stage on Fifth Avenue. My band's called Amici. So we came there. We were the first West Virginians on that stage. And I got off the stage and I'm smelling something, something really great. Someone's cooking. So behind the stage, I think it was on Madison Avenue or somewhere nearby there, somebody was cooking sausage and peppers there on a big stand, And I went over and they were making rice balls, arancini, all that stuff. And I could hear them speak Italian. And I went up and spoke Italian because I finally did learn to speak Italian pretty well. So I went up and spoke to them because they sounded like their accent was like from Calabria. And I went and talked to them and I said, are you from Calabria? And they said, yeah. And we were talking back and forth in Italian. And I said, well, we have relatives in Calabria. So narrowing it down, the guy actually knew my cousin who lives in Italy. Mm. I said, here I am. I'm from Clarksburg, West Virginia. I'm smack dab in the middle of Fifth Avenue in New York City. And a guy says, I know your cousin. And he really means it. It's not a joke. And I'm thinking there's just something different. Uniquely different about this.
And it's not an accident. These things are meant to be. I don't know how. I don't know why. But I've talked to so many people who had these kind of, I won't even say they're coincidental because I don't think they are. It's just meant to be. You were meant to be there when he was there and smell the peppers and sausage and all of that stuff. It's crazy. So that's a good segue though into your group. What kind of group is it and where do you perform? And
my group is called Amici. We started in 1984. We actually were playing in the street in Clarksburg when the festival, in the early days of the festival. The festival here began in 1979, and I played as a young boy the very first year. Played an electronic organ, played music all day on one day or whatever. But in 1984, I formed a group, and I just thought, we formed the group so we could play at the festival, and we played Italian songs. We played, pop American songs. We were just getting started and doing our thing. And so it's evolved into something now where it's like, here they call us tradition, which is interesting. But we play lots of Italian festivals in Pittsburgh. I played all over the years. We played in Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, throughout the tri-state area in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Even went to Washington, D.C. a couple times, and played for 2 Italian events. One was for an opera party, and Placido Domingo showed up. Didn't know that was happening.
Wow.
And that was at a restaurant there, Galileo's in D.C. I don't know if they're still there or not. And then there was one time we played in Cafe Milano there in Georgetown, and that was for governors' wives or something during a presidential inauguration weekend. And then, the opportunity came. I had a conversation with a guy named Anthony Nunziata, who's actually from New York there. And I said, Anthony, I think this band could do something with this Columbus Day thing. I had watched it on TV, or at least on the internet a few times. And he said, well, contact Columbus Citizens Foundation. So I talked to Karen DeMasi there. And I said, have a group. I said, I think we could help you out. And she said, well, send me some. Boom. A few days later, she said, I'd like to see you guys on the red carpet stage there. So we came last year and we played there. We ended up being the house band for the show, for the broadcast. So every time they'd go to commercial, we'd play, just like on the Tonight Show, And we played there right across from Central Park on 5th and 69th, a nice little stage. Worked with the people with ABC 7. Tony Lonnie was helping us out, and his staff from ABC, wonderful people to work with. And the Columbus Citizens Foundation, just excellent people. I mean, my God, the stuff that they do, everything was there. Joe Piscopo was there and a few others. And so we played, and we left, and then I talked with them there this year, and I said, do you need us? And they said, well, we'd like to have you back. So got the guys to say yes, and so we'll be back there on October the 13th from 12 to 3. We'll be the house band, and then at the end they do an interview with me, and then we play one specific song there at the stage, and then Joe Piscopo comes out and sings New York, New York, and I went down and sang with him on the red carpet, and the rest is history. It's really helped because you can play forever and ever in your hometown, but something like this, actually legitimizes the group. And we've worked hard, and I've tried my best to maintain some connection with Italian culture by way of songs and singing and music. And my big thing is that let's play the music, and for the time we're playing the music, let's let the people forget their troubles, their fights, their sicknesses, their worries, and just dance and enjoy the songs, enjoy the music, and, just connect to their Italian roots for as long as possible.
Yeah, well, maybe we could get you at our club, because I'm trying to do more cultural things with our club over here in New Jersey. So that would be fun. But we're definitely we're gonna be marching in the parade.
Okay, well, we'll see each
Columbus
other.
Day. Well, I'm definitely gonna stop by. I've been trying to. Since he's from New Jersey, I've been trying to get Joe Piscopo on my show, so maybe I'll make a connection.
I'll tell him you're looking for him. How about that?
That would be fantastic. I would love it.
We talked a little bit last year.
I've been following his career forever.
Yeah, he's been to Clarksburg a couple of times, and sometime I'll tell you the story about when he came to Clarksburg. Another heroic event that you'll be like, I can't believe this happened, Stephen. But I'll tell you that story another time. It's a great story.
Well, so before we go, if people want to book you or listen to your music or find you, where would they go?
Well, if you just look on our website, amiciwv.com, AMICIWV.com. And if you go to any of the streaming sites like Spotify or iTunes or any of those things, Pandora, Amazon Music, and you just put in Amici Rockin' the Streets, you'll hear our latest album. That's a mixture of some Frankie Valli stuff in English and in Italian, some Umberto Tozzi, Giancarlo Bagazzi, Gloria. We do just a variety of things. There's kind of like an EP, and then you can find me on Stephen Pishner. You could put me into any of those streaming sites and find a ton of music that I've recorded.
That's fantastic. And I'll put up all the links on the blog and in the video and everything.
And Instagram is at Stefano Pish.
Okay, very good. Well, Stephen, thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time.
I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you and your audience.